on a subject that is of relevance and importance to everyone who is a humanist. I'm really glad today that we have the privilege of speaking with Adam, someone who has experience on this topic. Adam wrote about it in last year's UUHA Journal of Religious Humanism. And just by way of a quick introduction, Rabbi Adam Shalom leads the Kol Hadash Humanistic Congregation in North Suburban Chicago, also serves as Dean for North America of the Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. And I'm so glad that Adam is joining us today. Adam, I will turn it over to you, and then in a little while, we will have a chance for questions and conversation.
Thank you, James, and thank you very much for the invitation. I was worried when you said I have experience in the area that I've died before, but no, I don't. I've certainly had experience helping people through the process, either of their own mortality or more often dealing with their family members who are facing death. And they're dealing with the reality of that challenge. And sometimes the experience of helping these families is really eye-opening to me about my own life and my own mortality. I think that, we all die. This is why you said it's important to everyone. It's important to everyone. We all die. Everyone we know will die at some point. And so we have to find a way to get our feet on the ground and to reach out to each other to maintain connections, but also to deal with the possible pain of loss that will come from those connections. About a decade ago, I received an email, and the subject line was "My Funeral." And I want to read you a selection from that email. "Dear Rabbi Shalom, I found you much too late in my life. For most of my life, I'm now 38, I have been an atheist with a strong and positive Jewish identity. Had I known that congregations like Kol Hadash existed, I would have happily involved myself and my family, my lovely wife and young daughters. And while my wife and children may in the future seek to involve themselves with Kol Hadash, my future is very short. I am dying of cancer. My oncologist predicts that I have 3 to 4 months left to live. That may not be a lot of time left to live, but it is a decent amount of time to plan a funeral. And that is what prompts me to contact you. Part 1 and 1 is the rabbi part, with a few parts spoken by people I highly trust. Ideally, these themes get across. There is no reason to be afraid or sad for the dead person. A dead person feels no pain, no sadness, no loss, no grief, no fear. A dead person is at peace. We need not pretend that the dead person is in heaven looking down on us. That's just an imaginary attempt to deny death in the first place. And there is no need because the dead person is just fine. Quintessential peace. What about those who suffer the loss but remain alive? A wife without a husband, children without their father, friends without a friend. Unlike the dead person, these people feel a huge amount of pain. What can they do to feel less pain, less loss? One thing they can try to do is invent an imaginary heaven where the lost person lives. That is, again, nothing more than an attempt to pretend that death never happened, and the heart won't fall for it. The real way to coping with the loss of a loved one does not eliminate the pain, but puts the pain to work. The more we remember the person we have lost, the most we have come to know that he or she has become part of who we are. The more we connect with others who have loved the person we have lost, the more we can share memories, both funny and sad, the more we learn that our grief connects us to the world. And as we meet more and more people who have lost loved ones, but who are strong and compassionate, who are strong and whole, the more confident we can become that over time, we too will become confident, whole, strong, and compassionate. That's part of the work our pain does. It makes us more compassionate toward the sufferings of others. This is just a brief outline of the ideas that I hope to get across. I hope also that the rabbi could add many more ideas from humanist Judaism, maybe a few humanist prayers, rituals, and I hope most of all that you'd be willing to be the rabbi mentioned above, the one who officiates my funeral. Rabbi Shalom, please say yes. Well, of course I said yes. In fact, what he described is exactly my approach to memorials, to mortality, to dealing with loss, and to facing my own. But this was a challenging funeral for me because he was in his late 30s. I was in my mid 30s. He had a spouse and two children. I had a spouse and two children. It was mortality in the mirror. And I actually talked with the couple, as I met with them a few times over the process of his decline, about the psychological phenomenon called transference and countertransference. And I assured them I would do my best not to work out my mortality issues through their experience with mortality. But it was a challenge because I knew that, there but for the roll of the cosmic dice, I would have gone. One of my favorite sayings about humanists' approach to mortality is that humanists believe in life before death. If this is the only world we know, if this is the only life we know we have, if our consciousness is based in our brain and our brain is made up of electrical signals and those signals end at some point in our timeline, then we celebrate the here and now. We focus on what we can do here and now, and we don't worry about what comes after because it may be that nothing comes after. And this idea goes all the way back to the early humanist philosopher Epicurus, who had no fear of death because he believed that human beings were composed of atoms and that when we died, the atoms dispersed and we simply were no more. Just as we knew not before we existed, we will know not when we are no more. But we need to go beyond philosophy because humanism is more than simply an abstract collection of principles. We have to acknowledge the reality of our situation, not only accepting our own mortality and understanding that indeed our lives also will end and the world will go on without us. It seems inconceivable that the world will continue without you, and yet it will. I remember a Life in Hell comic by Matt Groening, who also drew The Simpsons. It was about the process of becoming an adult. And he said that one of the stages is you realize that death is universal. And then another stage is you realize that death is inevitable. And then you realize that death applies to everyone. And then you realize that means you too. Those are two separate stages, right? Death applies to everyone. Death applies to me. Well, it's true. It's hard to face. And so we need to acknowledge that it's hard to face. Obviously, we know that we have needs when we lose people that we love. We feel pain, we feel emptiness, we feel sadness. Sometimes we feel anger. We have emotional needs that we need to acknowledge. And we also have a need to find a way to say goodbye. It's not an accident that every human culture has come up with some means of marking death. Now, we might find some of them backwards or unusual or just quirky from our perspective, but they are trying to respond to that basic universal human need to say goodbye in some way. I think they're also responding to a human need to remember. When you lose someone you love, you try to grab onto as many memories as you can because you're not going to make any more. And we also would like, I think on some level, to be remembered by other people, to feel like we've had a lasting impact and to feel that people will remember us when we're gone. So these rituals of death, memorial, monument, tombstone, whatever the tradition might be, they're all about remembering others, but also feeling like we will be remembered. And I guess on the basic level, we need to find comfort. If we're sad, if we feel empty, if we're angry, we need to find some way to get through those difficult emotions, to put one foot in front of the other, to wake up in the morning and to go on with our lives in some way, and hopefully to get better at doing that as time goes on. After all, what kind of humanists would we be if we saw human needs like these and said, suck it up? That's not a strong humanist stance, to just say, deal with it. I have no compassion. Compassion is part of humanism. And so we need to have compassion for ourselves when we face a loss and find ways to help others through that challenging experience. And I will say, the work that I do with families around death and dying is some of the most rewarding work that I do, and some of the most challenging work too. It's a very quick time frame generally. In Jewish tradition, you tend to bury within a few days of the person dying, depending on family circumstances and so on. But even in general American culture, funerals tend to happen relatively soon after the person dies, or even a memorial service after with a cremation or some other kinds of body disposal. But it's generally a fast time frame. You get a call and someone has died or is about to die. You work on scheduling meetings with the family and when the service is going to be. Are you going to have any home receptions or a Shiva call after the funeral? You then have the meeting with the family, which is sometimes an easy flow and sometimes it's like pulling teeth. I'll give you an example in just a moment. And then there's the writing and the creating and the leading of the memorial service, and in some ways being the person steering the boat for all these people through that process of the formalized version of mourning and saying goodbye. It's very gratifying when the work is well received. I know that what I'm doing is important. And I know that people are helped by what I do. It's one of the reasons I chose a profession of being a humanist clergy. I find it really valuable, and yet I gain more than I give. You know, it's a real privilege to be in those family meetings with the closest circle of people who have lost someone and have them share their most intimate stories with you. Now, sometimes they don't always want to share them, but sometimes they do. And that's the beginning of the healing process for them. It's such a privilege to have that backstage pass to how this comes together. And often the family meetings are even more healing than the public service. It's what starts the process. It's also why I encourage the families to do the funerals sooner than later. You know, some people want to wait 2 months when it's more convenient, but there's something about that family meeting and the sharing memories and thinking about how to say goodbye that helps deal with the loss. And so it's easier to do that sooner than to try and hold it for later. Sometimes when someone dies, a terrible beauty is born. I met a wedding photographer once at a wedding I was doing in Lincoln Park, a beautiful setting. I gave her my card in case she had any need for other wedding couples she was working with. And about 3 months later, I got a call from her. So I called her back and she said, "I need you to do my wedding." I said, "That's wonderful." She said, "Well, not entirely. My life partner that I've been with for 15 years has been diagnosed with brain cancer, and it's likely terminal. And we've decided to finally get married. We were never having kids. We didn't feel a need to get married, but he wants me to be able to have access to his Social Security as a survivor, and so we want to get married." And so I said, "I'll be happy to help in any way that I can." And so I met them in their house, in their living room. Jim was having a good day. He was able to stand for that part of the day. They each took books off the shelf with poems they wanted to read to each other. They had composed original vows to each other that they read to each other. And it was just the three of us, the two of them and me, because in Cook County, you don't need witnesses to sign the license. And it was a beautiful moment there. And then a few months later, I got a call. I was in the Detroit Institute of Arts, of all places, and Jim had died. And we arranged to do a funeral on New Year's Day. And the memorial service was held in the Newberry Library, which is a beautiful space in the city of Chicago. And some of Jim's friends spoke, and his wife spoke. In fact, his wife read the vows that they had written to each other that no one had heard before, because it had only been for the two of them. It was a truly beautiful moment, a terrible beauty. But it was so powerful for me to be even a small part of that experience. Now, this is a very different approach, the approach that humanists take, than that of traditional religion. When you think of a traditional funeral, you might think of a passage like this one from the 23rd Psalm. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." I mean, you can say it along with me if you want to. "He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. In the end, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Now, what does this say about death and mortality? It says, don't be afraid. The divinity is with you, and everything will be just fine. Now, these are assurances that a humanist clergy person generally is not going to make to somebody, because we don't think that there's a guarantee that everything is fine, that there's a divinity who's watching out for you, and that everything is going according to plan. Often religious people facing the end of life have absolute faith and confidence in miracles. Miracles will happen. Death can be averted. Don't worry. I heard one person explain it this way, that in Europe, they believe that death is inevitable, while in America, we believe that death is optional. I fear no evil, right? The disaster will avoid me, or it might hit somebody else, but it won't bother me. You know, when there's a plane crash and someone survives and they say, God saved me. And I say to myself, what about everybody else? Why do you think there's this bubble around you? But there's a belief that the disaster can be averted, that there's miraculous cures out there. I actually had a member of my congregation once tell me that her sister had a relapse of breast cancer. I'm sorry, her cousin had a relapse of breast cancer. And she said, well, if I give you her Hebrew name, would you say some prayers for her? And I said, I have a better idea. Instead of her Hebrew name, give me her phone number and I'll call her and we can talk. And maybe we can talk about her condition and she can get some perspective on it. Maybe if it's terminal, we can talk about what she wants to do with the last weeks of her life. Maybe we'll talk about the Chicago Cubs and distract her, and that's valuable too. I don't know that sending words out into the universe is going to make a difference. I don't think it does. But I do know that talking to her, making a positive personal connection, first of all, could help recovery. We know that positive attitudes help. But secondly, it will make a meaningful moment for her and for me to feel less alone and to feel that there's someone to listen to you. But that's dealing with reality as reality. That's not imagining that magic words to a magic location in a magic language are going to miraculously cure this cancer. I'm going to deal with the reality of what I can do, maybe find her a better doctor, maybe provide a positive attitude, but also to accept what reality might be. As I said, death is inevitable, not optional. And we know that people will sometimes say there's a certain process to getting over a loss. But I found that in many cases, you don't get over a loss, you get used to it. You find new ways to go through your life, and you get used to the reality the person is no longer there. And my father died about 5.5 years ago. And we had a generally good relationship, but, you know, we had our differences and disagreements. And there are times when an event happens or I see a news article and I think, boy, that would have been great to talk about with him. I see my kids growing older and I know that he would have really enjoyed spending time with them and talking with them as they became more mature. I feel regret sometimes. I don't feel sad like I would have, you know, in those first months. I've gotten used to it. It's just the reality that he's no longer with us, and that's part of that process. I once had the opportunity to do a baby welcoming event for the same family I had done a funeral for a few years, actually a few months before. The sister of the father of the baby had died in her early 30s from breast cancer. It had been a very aggressive form of breast cancer. She had fought it for many, many years. And when she died, her brother decided, along with his wife, of course, to name the baby after his sister who had died. Now, as you can imagine, the baby welcoming event was a mixed pot, you know. It was beautiful and wonderful because here's a new baby, and it was very sad because they knew how much the sister would have loved to be an aunt, and they knew that her name would live on in the baby, but there's also a bittersweet to that as well. It's one of these cases where your heart is full because you're feeling all of it at once, the joy and the sadness. But I found that a funeral where people never laugh is a failure because you need to find a way to uplift people, not just to focus on the death, and the suffering. So we accept that death is inevitable, not optional. A second contrasting approach between a religious approach and a humanist one. The religious, certainly the supernaturally focused religious, believe that death is not the end. There's a world to come, or there's reincarnation in this world, or there's a kind of immortality when you are dissolved in the sea that is the divinity. But the short version is death is not the end. There's something else out there. There's somewhere else out there. You continue in some meaningful way. Our approach is the opposite. For us, as far as we know, death is final. And we have to face that reality. And I'll sometimes say to people who say, well, wouldn't you be comforted by a concept of heaven or an afterlife? And I'd say to them, well, even if there were an afterlife, this person is gone for the rest of my life on this world. I will not be talking to my father again for a long time, if ever. So I need to get used to this reality. I need to face the reality that for the rest of my life, I'm not going to see them. And most likely, I'm never going to see them again. It makes this life feel more valuable, right? And we want to make the most out of this life. I remember someone asked Richard Dawkins once, if you don't believe in heaven, how can you get up in the morning? And he responded, that's why I get up in the morning, because I've only got so many mornings and I need to get up and get moving and do and learn all I can and experience what I can of the world. Now, there are times, of course, when a 30-year-old gets cancer and dies, or car accidents, any number of tragedies, when we feel cheated, we feel angry. You know, how could this happen? This is just not fair. That's fine. It's okay to feel angry, even if there's no personality out there to be angry at. Just like when I bang my head on the car door, I can be mad at the car, even though I know it's my fault and not the car's fault. I still feel the feeling, right? So we can feel cheated, we can feel angry, we can allow ourselves to feel what we feel. That's healthy. A third approach that's challenging when we're dealing with it as humanists in a religious world, and that is the fact that people believe the world is fair, the world makes sense. And so they make funerals primarily about praising God. In Jewish tradition, when you hear about somebody's death, you would say, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, blessed is the true judge. And at a funeral service, you recite a text that's called the Kaddish, which is, as you'll see, entirely about God and not at all about people. Glorified and sanctified be God's great name throughout the world, which he has created according to his will. May he establish his kingdom in your lifetime and during your days within the life. It's all about God. In fact, the Kaddish text, this is a version called the Mourner's Kaddish, but there are other varieties of Kaddish prayer that are recited with almost the same wording throughout the traditional daily service, because it's all about praising God. It has nothing to do with the person who died. This is part of that expression of the world is fair, the world makes sense, this is all part of the plan. And we don't agree that there is a cosmic plan, that there's a playwright who has designed everything for our benefit, or even without our benefit, is running the show. Pardon the expression, but shit happens. The universe is indifferent to us. Tragedies take place, and we should call them tragedies. Ultimately, we can't stop them. We can try to minimize them, but we can always offer caring in response to them. I did a funeral for a 3-month-old who died in his crib. I did a funeral for a teenager who died of an overdose. There are car accidents and aneurysms and all kinds of crises. In the end, though, as humanists, we ask a different question. The religious will sometimes ask, why did this happen? As if there was some kind of cosmic reason that could be found to justify this random tragic occurrence. And in our case, why is sort of the wrong question. We can ask how, in terms of how did it happen? What can we do to prevent this in the future? What can we learn from it? We can ask how, but why is not really the right question. People will ask it, of course, and sometimes the right answer is there is no why. That's not how we understand the world, because good things happen and bad things happen. If we can make them happen, then that's the why. So hopefully we can learn to shift our answers to accept an indifferent universe and to look more in the how to resolve it and be able to let go of the why. Now, a last principle of a traditional religious funeral you'll sometimes find, this is a Yiddish phrase, all the dead men are holy or pious. You don't speak ill of the dead. You only talk about good things. And sometimes that's challenging, because what if the person who died was a real jerk? I met with a family once, and I asked them to tell me some things about their relative who had died. And they said he worked hard and he loved his family. And they stopped talking. So then I said, okay, talk to me a little bit about him as a father. What was he like? He worked hard and he loved his family. All right. Did he have any hobbies? He worked hard and he loved his family. And I realized that he was a jerk, but they didn't want to say any bad things to me, lest I get up at the funeral and then share all these bad things about him. So what I did at that point in the meeting was I put down my paper and I put down my pen and I said to them, look, I need to be able to paint an honest picture of your father who's died. And so off the record, tell me some things about it. And once they got started talking, once they got some of the negative stuff out of the way, they were able to share some nice things that I was able to include. And I sneakily picked up my pen and took some notes on the good stuff. And you can always find ways to frame it positively. So if you get someone who is very critical, you could say, she had high standards. Or if you have someone who pushed you to excel, right? And the family knows what you mean by that, but it sounds respectable for the public audience. You're not lying. I mean, I wouldn't lie about somebody, but you want to find the right balance of honesty and respect. Because I was at a funeral once where this was one of my relatives who had died, and the rabbi was not accurate. Now, it wasn't his fault because he only knew what the family had told him, but the family had only told him the nice stuff. And so I felt it was less satisfying to me anyways. You know, these mourning rituals that a lot of cultures have combine primordial fear of spirits and bad juju with some psychological wisdom. You know, in traditional Jewish life, you would have a time called Shiva after someone had died, where you stay in your home and people come visit you. And some of the rituals of covering the mirrors and not washing, and that's part of the superstition. But the idea of staying still, of having people in your home to visit, to provide comfort and company to you, that can be positive. Having a strictly prescribed ritual might not be helpful, but having people around you is helpful. So hopefully, you know, as humanists, we can take the best of these traditions that are part of our cultural and religious heritage and adapt them to a humanistic purpose. After all, we don't have to fully respect the dead in the way that we would deny the reality of their flaws. And yet we don't have to say everything that is rationally true. We can talk in terms of what we might call a natural immortality, not that your consciousness lives on, but that the effects of your life live on, your good deeds live on. If you have children, your genes are living on. If you did good things in the world, the impact of those, like a ripple in a lake, those continue. Now, I once heard an account of the famous 1960s and 70s atheist Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who was on a talk show, and she was asked once, well, if you don't believe in heaven, what happens after you die? And she said, you rot. Well, rotting may be true, but it's hardly comforting to people in that moment. So maybe we can find a better answer than you rot. You live on in the memories of people who love you. You live on in the good deeds that you've done, right? That's a little more satisfying. So when it comes to actually running a memorial service, there are some general principles that we follow in trying to create a meaningful event. First of all, the primary focus of the service is a celebration of life. So you don't read psalm after psalm after psalm or poem after poem that's not personal. You might read some poetry for sure, but you also talk about the person who's gone and what their life was like. You make the story of their life the center of the service, the lessons they taught through their example, the memories that their family has. I will say one of the secrets, if anyone on here is an officiant who does services, one of the secrets to a good humanist funeral is you listen very carefully to how the family describes them, and then you repeat it back to them. And after the service, they'll tell you, it's just like I remembered him, because it is exactly how they remembered him. So we need to focus on their life and make it a celebration of life. This is not unique to us. Other religious traditions do this too, but this is a core part of a humanist memorial. Second, is that you have to balance the needs and values of the deceased and of the living. As you may know, not all families agree on everything. In fact, most families disagree on some things, and some disagree on big things, including religion. So if you have, let's say, a religious person who's died, but you have humanist children who are running the memorial service, well, you need to find the right balance of how to respect both who the deceased was and the needs of the living, right? We want to serve the needs of the living, but not to be dishonest to the person who died. And vice versa. If the person who died was secular and one or more of the kids are religious, you need to find a compromise there too. I did one funeral where one kid was religious and one kid was secular. And so we sort of split the difference, where I led the memorial service in the funeral home with the husband of the religious woman reciting one of the traditional prayers called El Malei Rachamim, God full of mercy. And then the graveside service where the coffin was interred was led by the Orthodox child's rabbi. And so they got a fully religious graveside service, and the other one got a mostly secular funeral home service. And both sides felt like they had been respected, they had been included, and they had been listened to and had their needs met. But this is where you have to understand you're balancing needs and desires of multiple perspectives and of the deceased and of the living. Sometimes, by the way, you'll get a person who dies who says, I don't want any memorial. Don't do any memorial for me. And sometimes the kids will come to me and say, but we need to do something. And I will say to them, do it. It's okay. You have needs too. And just like your parent couldn't tell you what to wear after a certain age, they can't tell you how to mourn or how not to mourn. So sometimes it's okay to say your needs come first. A third approach that we have to balance is the needs of the moment versus what will the needs of the future be. You know, sometimes at the moment, you need to acknowledge what really happened. This person had a long decline, and it was very difficult. They were cranky and combative, and it was very hard on their family to see them go through this. In the end, they didn't feel like the person that they loved and that they knew. But when we say goodbye to someone in a circumstance like that, our job is to help people move forward by getting more perspective. You know, when someone has just died of a serious illness, it's like you're standing next to a barn and you can't see anything around it. But over time, you get some distance and you see that barn in the full landscape of their life, and it becomes part of their life, but not the only thing you're thinking of. Those last few years loom large, and we have to focus on the full life and not just the decline. In the long run, the lasting memories, what you want to emphasize in a memorial, is how they lived the 95% of their life when they were them, not just the last few years. Those are important to acknowledge, but don't let it dominate the experience. You want to help people see the full picture of their life, because in 5 years, that's what they need to remember, not just the last one. And finally, as I've been saying all along, we need to acknowledge reality about the deceased in the situation and acknowledge our feelings. As I said, we can be angry at a loss, but you know what? When someone has lived a long life and they're suffering at the end, maybe you feel relief when they're gone, and that's okay. That's totally natural. They're no longer in pain. One of our jobs for people we love is to reduce their pain. And we might even feel, and this might feel paradoxical, but at the end of a long and a happy life, you might even feel good. They had a good, long life. They loved their family loved them, they had wonderful experiences, they got to see great-grandchildren, they lived to 95, they were living on their own till 93. As one of the kids of a funeral I did for someone like that said, where can I sign up for this? I'll take that deal. You know, I see people online very sad because some entertainer has died at 95. And again, they lived a great life. And I'm not sad. They lived a good life. You know, that you say, congratulations, well done. And so sometimes it's okay to be positive at the end. I'll share one example, and then I'll open up for questions. I see there's been a couple in the comments that I'll get to in a moment. This is a poem that I often use at humanist memorials. I actually found it initially in a Reform Jewish prayer book, so a liberal Jewish prayer book. And but it speaks in such beautiful humanist language that I found it very useful for us to use as well. It's called Epitaph by Merritt Malloy. When I die, give what's left of me away to children and old men who wait to die. And if you need to cry, cry for your brother walking the street beside you. And when you need me, put your arms around anyone and give them what you need to give to me. I want to leave you something better than words or sounds. Look for me in the people I've known or loved. And if you cannot give me away, at least let me live in your eyes and not in your mind. You can love me most by letting hands touch hands, by letting bodies touch bodies, and by letting go of children that need to be free. Love doesn't die, people do. So when all that's left of me is love, give me away. Isn't that better than you rot? This is the one life we know that we have. And so we need to make the most of it, but everything good comes to an end. And until we can upload our consciousness to the cloud, death is real, and death will be real. And facing this reality with courage and with compassion is a humanist choice. So with that, I will take a look at our chat comments and questions. Working back,
Awesome.
Carl Sagan's wife said something similar about love and not asking for more time. That's right. For those who believe that heaven isn't a place, is heaven an experience? Can you explain the discussion? Well, part of that depends on whether you are taking heaven in sort of the literal religious concept of a geography, or if you're taking it sort of metaphorically. Like I was a child of the 80s. There's a Belinda Carlisle song called Heaven is a Place on Earth. But it's because when I love you and we're together, it's like we're in heaven. But it's using heaven as a commonly understood metaphor for a really good place. I mean, ultimately, when people are talking about an afterlife, they're looking for a personal immortality, and they want their consciousness to continue in some way. I've often wondered why people feel like a reincarnation where you have no memory of your past life is comforting. That's, I mean, part of the point is I want more life. I'm like Oliver Twist, please, I want some more. But if that's what there is, then that's what there is. So I haven't heard people use heaven as an experience, as something your consciousness finds after death, other than in a religious context. Someone else says, yes, an example of a family where one child had the funeral much more Christian than the rest of the family would have chosen. And it's one of those challenges that families have to negotiate and work together on. And I'll be honest, family dynamics are sometimes made better through difficult circumstances, but often they're just intensified. So if there is family division, you add a death and trauma, and it's just going to add stress to that crack that's already there, and it can make it very, very difficult. So I'm sorry for the experience that you had in that circumstance. This is one of those cases where sometimes actually having separate events work. I actually had a member of my congregation who had religious family, and they insisted on a religious funeral for the mother who had died, but they were open to having me lead a home Shiva service at the home of my member. So one of the nights that the family was getting together was at this member's home, and I led the service there, and it was a humanistic service. And they felt, again, like their needs had been met. So sometimes when there is theological diversity within family, it's a good idea to, create multiple events sometimes that give people a chance for their own healing process if you can't find a neutral ground or some compromise in the middle for the main event. Okay, Helen, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm a therapeutic musician, which means I've been trained to play at bedside, and I do a lot of hospice work, and I do memorial services, and I share it's such an honor to be allowed into that space. But you haven't said anything about music, and my experience is that sometimes people will come up to me and say that the music gets to them in a way that words never could. So I just wonder.
Oh, absolutely. If a family finds music to be an important part of who they are or where they find comfort, absolutely try to work that in. I mean, this was not a comprehensive how to do a humanist funeral program. Poetry is important, music is important. Sometimes you have family members who play instruments and they can make that a part of the memorial service. Or if the person themselves valued an instrument, you can play a selection from that. And it can be pop music too. I did a funeral for someone who loved the Beatles. And so we picked a selection from While My Guitar Gently Weeps, which was his favorite song of all time. And so we played that as part of the memorial service. But for the people who knew him, they knew how much he loved the Beatles. And that was a valuable way to create space for them to remember them. So absolutely, music, art. One other idea that's not verbal but visual is a lot of families now will create either a photo montage digitally or a poster board or just a table with a lot of framed photos of the person who's died from many stages of their life. And that can be really beautiful because then people will go by that table and see them as a child and as an adult and as a senior, and they'll remember them from different ages. And it's really wonderful, even for me, who only knew them at the end of life, if I knew them at all. Sometimes I don't even know them before they've died. To be able to see them in all those stages of life. And it puts a picture to the stories that I tell about who they were from. So absolutely nonverbal, whether it's visual or musical, very, very important. I see Aspen has a hand up too.
Yes, I was wondering, have you been in a situation where some of your congregants use God as like metaphor in their, and like require you like to use like the metaphorical God? Because for myself, the metaphorical concept of God, I identify more on the religious naturalist side of things, really resonates with me. I mean, I know that in Judaism, like the Reconstructionist movement, I know sort of gravitates to that God as metaphor situation. But as a humanist clergy, are you comfortable or have you ever done that in your work with funerals?
Yeah, thank you. I generally don't. I mean, that's one of the lines we draw between Reconstructionist Judaism, which you've accurately described, and humanistic Judaism, where we want to say clearly what we believe in sort of tangible, practical terms. And God is a metaphor that doesn't work for me because it also means that old guy in the sky telling you no. But, it doesn't lose that association for me. So I would, if I want to talk about love, I'll say love. If I want to talk about beauty, I'll say beauty. And I don't feel the need to use the God language to say other things that we have other words for. Now, individual members might prefer to do that in their own, private practice or how they approach things. And I'm certainly fine if family members wanted to recite the traditional Kaddish because they're attached to the sound of the Aramaic and the rhythm and the fact that their generations have said it and so on. I'm happy to have family members recite that as part of the memorial service. I don't lead it. I do have a humanistic version that has a similar cadence and sound to it, but praises peace in the world instead of praising the divine name. And that works for me content-wise, and it works for some people rhythm-wise. But other people want the traditional text, and I'm fine to have them have it as part of the service. I'm facilitating it. If they think of it as metaphor, or they just think of it as I'm quoting an old text and connecting to my roots, then that's fine. I give them that option. I don't insist that everything be done exactly as I would say it. I just don't say it. And sometimes that's a compromise enough for most people. And some people don't like the idea of changing the Kaddish at all. They say, I'd rather read another poem that's unrelated to it, like Epitaph or other examples, rather than change the words to that old text. It feels like, I don't know, like if you wanted to sing, I bless America, it's kind of clunky. You can't lose the original there. So maybe that's what it feels like if they change that canonical text like that. Other people like the idea. It's like a jazz riff on a classic melody, or a rhapsody on a theme by Paganini. That works. So fine. You create options for people, and ultimately, again, humanism is about empowering people to be in charge of their own lives and make their own choices. And if they choose to use some more religious text in a memorial service that speaks to them, then we can find a way to do that. But as a humanist clergy person, I'm not going to do it. But I'm happy to allow other people. And when family members get up and speak, if they want to talk about heaven, that's up to them because it's what they believe. It is open mic, no censorship when family's up there speaking.
Yeah, there's a question from Mike in the
Yes.
chat.
I was raised Jewish. Talk about your transition to humanist rabbi. Well, there's an assumption there. I was actually raised as a humanistic Jew. I did not transition at all. I've never transitioned in any way in my life, other than to a beard. That's about it. And I guess to a father. But there are many people who are raised in a more conventionally religiously Jewish way. But over time, they decide they don't believe in the content of those traditional prayers or the theology that's involved. And so they decide to try something new. They might migrate denominations, or they might decide that ultimately a secular approach is the most meaningful for them, but they still want Jewish community. And so they find other like-minded people who share their cultural Jewish identity, a connection to Jewish holidays and food and language and culture, but again, disagree with the traditional theology. And they work together to create community, to write new blessings, don't have to use the old ones, to study Jewish history from an academic and archaeologically supported way, as opposed to just what the traditional story said. And they get a lot of meaning out of that combination of roots that help them understand who they are and where they come from, and the intellectual honesty of saying what they believe and finding a way to celebrate their Jewishness in harmony with those humanistic beliefs. So that's us in a nutshell. Obviously, there's a lot longer answer to that question, and I'm happy to include in we're going to be posting the video of this online at some point, and we'll include links for resources and so on related to this and to humanistic Judaism more broadly. Or you know what? There's this wonderful thing out there called Google, and if you type in humanistic Judaism, you'll find all kinds of resources, videos, materials, and that would be a great way to explore more if anyone's curious to find out more about that.
I'm Mike Franch. I'm an ethical culture leader and affiliate minister at First Unitarian Church in Baltimore. We met at the Humanist thing in Washington. When I do a memorial service, I view it, I introduce it as it's a rite of transition. This person will not be in our lives anymore the way that they had been. We can't call them up, we can't send them emails, but they'll still be with us for our entire life. And so that memory is there. I also tend to end by saying, you're here because this person enhanced your life. Well, understand that you also brought something to their life, as you will continue to do to other people. And finally, I think we absolutely agree, but I still see myself as in the tradition of the religious rather than the secular. And I define what to do with the religious ceremony.
That's one of these vocabulary debates that will go on for the rest of time over, are we secular religious? Are we religious religious? That's vocabulary, but I agree that we agree on the content. I will say on the idea of they'll be with you your whole life. There's a wonderful line in Mitch Albom's book, Tuesdays with Maury, where Maury says, death ends a life, not a relationship. And you can still talk to people, you still think of them in some way. And about 8 years ago, the Chicago Cubs finally won the World Series, the first time since 1906 or 1908 or whatever. And there were these really beautiful pictures of people going to their parents' and grandparents' graves and putting a Chicago Cubs jersey on the headstone, or drinking a beer, or otherwise celebrating with them, because this person had introduced them to the love of baseball and to the love of the team. And it was just a very touching moment to see all these people still connecting with people that they knew were gone, but they were sharing that memory because they were still with them in that meaningful way. Any other last comments or questions?
I had just two thoughts that are on the edge of this, perhaps. One of them is I proposed to the UU to have my funeral before I died, and to be able to invite the people I wanted to have there and to talk about my life, and we could talk back and forth. Not a lot of enthusiasm for that. And there's another piece to it, which is something called compassion and choice, which isn't exactly funerals, but it has to do with control over your dying, not afterward or before, but control over it. It's a national organization dealing with people who want to have some control over their death. So I'm putting these two pieces together. I don't know whether the local church, local UU will be at all interested, and I may have to go. I shouldn't have to go, but find another venue that's more comfortable for including these two people in my life. I want to see what people have to say at my funeral.
Yeah. We actually had a speaker from a parallel organization that was Illinois based come and speak at our community. And it was a wonderful experience. And he talked about some of the challenges of getting these laws passed and what the resistance has been for people to have death with dignity or to be able to choose how their lives end. And actually, in my own family, we had an aunt who took advantage of this in Canada, where it is now legal to do that. And she actually had a goodbye party about a month before she ended it. She got everyone in together, and my daughter and my wife flew out there and had a chance to spend some time with her. Actually, it was just my wife because my daughter was still in school. But she had a chance to say goodbye at a big party, and it was totally sad, in its own way, but it was also joyful in its own way. And I will say that some of the easiest funerals I do are people who are like 102. Not only because people aren't really sad, it's sad but not tragic when someone at 102 dies, but also because they just had a 100th birthday party and they had everyone show up and they had all the speeches and all the events and all the programs, and they collected all the pictures and they told all the stories. And so they just hand me the book that they printed. That's my my Bible for the funeral. So all you have to do, Mr. Kalish, is get to a milestone birthday and have a blowout event. And you could make your milestone 87, by the way. I don't care what number it is. Have a milestone birthday, have a blowout event, and don't tell anyone that in your mind, it's the Tom Sawyer seeing your own funeral experience.
I am 87, by the way.
Oh, there you go. It's magic. Like, please.
Yeah, I was just going to note for those who are interested in death with dignity efforts, it's something that the UUHA has been involved in through some of our partners who are working on those efforts directly, and is certainly something that we can explore additional programming and outreach, lobbying type efforts if people are interested in exploring that further. Certainly something I personally support, but also something we support as an organization.
It's a good idea. Yeah. I wanted to just
future programming.
Yes, future programming. I thought that that Aspen's question and Lika's response is an interesting subject for Unitarian Universalists, because there's often a lively debate about whether God language can and should be used metaphorically, what it's a metaphor for, and it's a rich discussion. But it's interesting because I think people come down on different places about that. The word means different things. Like Adam, some people, it's going to conjure the traditional image, and trying to turn it into something else is a bit too much of a stretch. For some people, in liberal theology, there's a whole range of theologies that are sort of non-literal, and so it can be a bit of a complicated and challenging thing, I think, in UU spaces when that comes up, even for humanists.
I agree, if I can jump in as well.
Please.
And I also find the reverse in some ways, that, as I said in my comment, that's never the first place I start with planning something. And I've found with multiple funerals I've done that, I tend to specialize in complicated religious situations where, one of them, for example, I'm thinking of, the half of the family was very devout Catholic, and the children of the deceased said, I better not see a Bible or hear the word God. So, it was a very, very much of a gap between their approaches. And what I've found is that I have had many times someone come up to me who I know to be a very devout religious person who, embraces some of the traditional God language, come up to me after a funeral and talk about how meaningful and how moving it was. And it seems like they, didn't even notice that I didn't use the word God. So, I also think that it, if handled well, that people who do embrace, religious, God not as a metaphor, language, sometimes don't realize how meaningful our humanistic approach can be, even within their own worldview.
And what you've done is you've met their needs, right? That very basic human need for saying goodbye, feeling sad, remembering, laughing, all those pieces that make a good humanist funeral, make a good funeral. And so people sometimes don't even notice that we haven't said the G word, simply because we have met their needs and created a meaningful experience.
If I may, on this comment, I myself am an aspiring lay clergy, and so in this thing, I'm often I've never done a funeral per se, but I'm very inspired by a lot of religious humanism, and sort of I would say I'm culturally Christian still, in the idea that I find the Christian mystics to be very fascinating, and of course Jewish mysticism as well, which I still think in a way you can be mystical with in a secular fashion. That's a whole other conversation. So, but I see where everyone's coming. It's a very tricky, avenue to navigate, because when you're already coming from a post-God, post-theist, non-God area, using God language can be quite confusing to those who are, who use it in the literal. But I can see the damage. Definitely, someone brought up in recovery culture, which I don't support the idea of AA or NA using God language, because I do think that that's weaponizing theology to make people get, healthier and sober. And I don't agree with that, because I don't think that's actually getting sober, because, you're doing it for not yourself, but for God. But that's another question again. But I can see it's a very tricky situation, and you gotta approach your audience and who you're speaking to about.
Right. And that's the number one approach. The number one goal of a humanist memorial is meet the needs of the people who are there to experience it. And sometimes you meet them halfway with where they are and where you are. And sometimes it's a perfect fit. And I've had people who find our community through the process of seeing a funeral that we've done and say, this is who I am. This is what I want. There was actually a survey done, maybe it was not 20, I'm getting old, 20 years ago. There was a survey I read that they asked people an interesting question. They said, do you expect to have a religious funeral? And it's an interesting proxy question for, are you religious or not? And it was a surprisingly large number, more so than said they were secular. So they expected to have a secular or non-religious funeral. And this is also, by the way, one of those things we're talking about: advanced planning, advanced directives, death with dignity, and so on. This is one of those things that's very important to let your family know ahead of time, not just where the key to the safety deposit box is and who the beneficiaries are on the retirement accounts, but what would you want at your funeral? Is there someone you'd like to speak? Are there messages you want to convey? I mean, that email I read to you at the beginning of the program was someone saying, here's the message I want at my funeral. And it was, my job was to help share that. And he was very clear in what kind of funeral he wanted. And the more clear you can be with your family in terms of what you would want, the more likely they'll, even if it's not perfectly their cup of tea, they'll know that's who you were. I actually did a funeral for a member of my congregation. There were 3 kids that survived the woman who died. 2 of them were humanistic Jews, and one of them had become a Messianic Christian, even though he'd been raised Jewish and was very religious, obviously. And so the family had good communication. They had talked a bit in advance, but we also talked it together about how to meet the needs for everybody. And the woman who died had been a scientist and had been totally secular, but the siblings knew that the more religious brother might want something. So I think they had him do a reading of a biblical passage or something like that, that the other sisters knew in advance, and it wasn't too Jesus Christy, and they were fine with it. So they had to work it out. But the fact that even the religious person knew clearly what the mother would have wanted helped that dynamic and that process for the family. So the more explicit you can be with that advance directive, the better for everybody. I mean, you won't notice, most likely, but it will help other people.
The survey, the question about the funeral that you mentioned reminds me that, I just saw the most recent round of headlines, heralding the fact that America is becoming increasingly secular and less religious. So more and more people are leaving traditional religious worldviews behind, and this is the kind of subject that is extremely relevant.
The challenge, though, is that the people leaving religion aren't necessarily flocking to UU humanism or humanistic Judaism. They are none of the above, not alternate. And that part of our challenge is to sell them on the benefit of community and the benefit of a core philosophy. And that's sometimes a harder sell without either the fear or the love of the cosmos. And so both of us are in the same boat in that respect, that the growth of secularism doesn't necessarily mean the growth of humanism.
Yeah, something we talk about a lot, definitely, and a subject for many future discussions, I'm sure.
Right, and we're not going to grow market share through funerals, at least not directly. Well, thank you all very much. Thanks for signing in. It was a pleasure to be with you, and have a good night. And tell people you love that you love them.